A quick look back. In the first Currie lecture, we considered whether it might be helpful to call our current cultural context the Great Awokening. Are there historical parallels to the first two Great Awakenings? I answered yes. Does identifying and exploring those parallels enable us to get a better interpretive grip on the current moment? Again, I answered yes. Our current woke moment and the first two Great Awakenings share the following hallmarks and dynamics. 1, moral and ethical issues occupy a central place in the broader cultural conversation. 2, human sin and moral failures are identified as a concern for both individuals and society. 3, moral judgment is severe. The irredeemable face threats of punishment. You will burn in a lake of fire. You will be canceled. 4, the push for greater moral accountability brings about positive change. And 5, it also divides communities. People disagree over the pronouncements made and the tactics being employed by the awake and the woke. We concluded the first lecture by considering Flannery O'Connor's story, Everything That Rises Must Converge. In this story, the methods a young man uses to confront his mother's real and toxic racism plunge the two of them deeper into brokenness and grief. In the second Currie lecture, we considered 3 challenges the Great Awakening presents to the church. 1, we live in a post-Protestant moment. American society bears the imprint of Protestantism's ethical instincts, but it no longer shares the church's metaphysics, its belief in God. At the same time, Protestant churches and the clergy who lead them do not wield the cultural influence they did even a half-century ago. Protestant churches in this country have largely been decentered. 2, we suffer from cultural truth decay. Aspects of American society no longer seem to share the same reality. We trust each other's judgment less and less. Our sense of alienation is on the rise. Truth decay has been especially hard for communities of diverse perspective and moral discourse like churches. 3, righteous anger is everywhere. The slogan of the Great Awakening is, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. We use anger as a critique, a currency, and a lever. On one hand, we describe the anger of our cultural enemies as unhinged, frightening, and dangerous. On the other hand, we hold our own anger up as a badge of honor, as a rallying point. In the midst of all this anger, we have become vulnerable as individuals and groups to manipulation, to those who seek to fan the flames of our rage for political gain or for profit. All this anger has toxic consequences for churches. We concluded the second lecture by considering Scott Alexander's dystopian story, Sort by Controversial. In this piece of short fiction, a Silicon Valley startup tasks its computer with generating statements that will, when dropped into a social media feed or a water cooler conversation, trigger volatile arguments. The story calls these toxic nuggets scissor statements, weaponized opinions designed to tear communities apart. The third and final Currie lecture for 2021 is entitled Church. Today, we will focus on ways in which the contemporary church might respond to the pressures and opportunities presented by the Great Awakening. Three questions will hover over our work. 1, can the Great Awakening move the church toward faithfulness? 2, what might the contemporary church bring to the table set by the Great Awakening? And 3, what faithful roles can today's decentered churches play in this new season of ethical revival? These questions will, I hope, set the stage so that we can consider a theological framework, or maybe more accurately, a spiritual mindset for engaging this moment. Peace, unity, and purity. When the Presbyterian Church USA ordains and installs elders and deacons, the candidates for ordination are asked a series of constitutional questions. These ordination vows ground people in God's calling and the Reformed tradition, even as they sketch a sweeping and humbling vision of what the church expects of its leaders. Reverend Thomas R. Jr., a former Currie lecturer, provocatively suggests that the shortest of these vows also happens to be the most challenging. Do you promise to further the peace, unity, and purity of the church? I think Tom R. is right. And I want to take a moment today to zoom in on this vow. First, because awakening movements typically put those in the church who strive for purity and those in the church who work for unity at odds with each other. And second, because this vow can, I think, be a resource as we consider the church's role in this time. The purity of the church. Those who prioritize purity often find the church and its leadership lacking, too passive, too mealy-mouthed, too weak when it comes to contentious moral issues and broad ethical conversations. These folk prod the church, its leaders and preachers, to describe the ethical landscape in the clearest possible terms and to direct listeners toward a righteous path. They fear that churches that do not address pressing ethical issues with moral passion have sold their souls. This, you will remember, was precisely the criticism Theodorus Frelinghuysen offered of colonial congregations in the cultural windup to the First Great Awakening. Those concerned with the purity of the church's witness can be found at every point along the theological or political spectrum. And they do disagree as to what constitutes impurity, but they share the same general concern. The church is forever being tempted to tone down the radical truth of the gospel to escape conflict. Soft peddling the gospel, they assert, is not the way of faith. It's not consistent with the vision of a sacrificial and suffering church as presented in the New Testament. And as such, those concerned with purity encourage preachers to pursue the moral high ground even when it's painfully divisive. There's a cost to discipleship. The teaching and proclamation of Jesus Christ got him crucified. How about you, preacher?
Sidebar. One of the most intriguing examples of a purist preacher in contemporary literature can be found in James McBride's The Good Lord Bird, winner of the 2013 National Book Award. McBride tells the tale of John Brown, the Christian firebrand and commander of a militia whose revulsion over the moral scourge of slavery leads him to make violent attacks on slaveholders and eventually a doomed assault on Harper's Ferry, a botched scheme that nonetheless pushes the country into civil war.
In the novel, Brown's intense purity is viewed by some as courageous, by some as lunacy, by some as evil, and by some as nothing short of glorious. I commend this powerful and thought-provoking portrait to you. Sidebar over. The unity of the church. Those who prioritize unity point out that the church has always been composed of folk who disagree over consequential matters. It's always been easier, unifiers point out, to split a church than it is to nurture a diverse community. There have been plenty of ideologically pure preachers who've hammered away on some of the finer points of an ethical issue until their congregations were reduced to close-knit communities of one. Doesn't the book of Acts tell the story of Peter being encouraged by the Holy Spirit to let go of his demands for ethical purity and to expand his vision of whom God welcomes into community? Those who lean toward unity in the church acknowledge that the important role that moral clarity and ethical action play in the body of Christ. But they also point out that those who champion particular moral issues are not the only folk bringing heartfelt concerns to worship. This is a basic point, but I think it bears repeating precisely because it's so often lost in the shuffle. Every Sunday, when preachers step into the pulpit, they bring with them a jumble of faithful concerns. Some arise from the biblical text or the liturgical season. Some come from a tearful conversation held alongside a freshly dug grave. Some come from the fight that broke out after Friday night's high school basketball game, and some from a text sent by a member of the youth group. And yes, some come from the op-ed section of the newspaper. All of this is to say, people come to church hoping to hear a word from God that might be relevant to all sorts of different topics and circumstances. And this variety belies a laser beam focus on purity. Think of it this way, say those who lean toward the unity side of the equation. Jesus was crucified for who he was and for what he proclaimed. But we cannot forget that Jesus spent a whole lot of time gathering a diverse group of disciples who would have splintered into a million pieces if the glue holding them together was moral or theological purity. Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector had every reason to hate each other. Simon would have considered Matthew a traitorous sellout to the Romans, and Matthew would have looked on Simon as a violent radical. What brought these two rivals together was not ideological agreement, but the summons of Christ, the love of Christ. And in this, we would do well to remember, according to the Gospel of John, that Christ's final prayer before being crucified was that his followers be unified. Do you promise to further the peace, unity, and purity of the church? The words in this vow want to spring away from each other, and therein lies the theological genius of the peace, unity, and purity vow. In binding your unity and purity to each other, the vow grounds Christian leaders in a healthy theological tension. Our passion for embracing a righteous ethical path ought to be flavored with love for the diverse people Christ calls into community, and vice versa. The affection we have for our communities ought to be infused with Christ's calling to live radically moral lives. In embracing this tension, the peace, unity, and purity vow offers congregations, clergy, and even seminaries a way to think about how Christian community might engage the Great Awakening. In calling us to work for the purity of the church's witness, this vow encourages us to wade into conversations about the ethical issues of the day, and to do so in a way that manifests God's love for all who gather around the table. Doing this, engaging moral issues in a community of diverse perspectives, plunges us into a brave new world. Swimming in choppy water. Does the current context really present a unique challenge to the church? Hasn't Christian community always been called to discuss complicated moral issues? Well, yes, this is true. But the growth and use of social media platforms as the primary gathering places, testing grounds, and bullhorns for today's ethical conversations and moral movements presents the contemporary church with fresh challenges. Case in point, the Me Too movement and Black Lives Matter. Both of these movements raise topics of moral concern that resonate with the church's core ethical teachings about human dignity, the equality of people before the law, and the corrosive effects of violence. The church must talk about these movements, evaluate their arguments, and consider the ethical paths they chart. These movements have the power to unmask significant wrongs in culture and church. Still, many churches and clergy fear touching these topics. Part of this has to do with a polarized and politicized media who characterize these movements in such starkly different ways. People walk into church or tune into Zoom church with already formed and strongly held opinions. Depending on their preferred news sources, the faithful approach these movements ready to embrace and defend or to criticize and dismiss. Now, this sort of tribalism is nothing new, but like other periods of awakening, it's especially zealous in the Great Awokening. Another reason churches have difficulty speaking about these movements has to do with their decentralized nature. These movements are grounded in real life events, but they arise out of online moral laboratories. In other words, anyone can post something to a social media platform and append the hashtag Black Lives Matter to it. There's no communications department out there vetting these posts, making sure that they hew to the core values and stated goals of an organization. When it comes to standards for evidence, rules for respectful dialogue, and editorial control over what these movements are about, it's the Wild West out there. Every online conversation is a swirl of voices and opinions. Some are new voices, tentatively trying to find their way into a conversation. Some are docents trying to teach others how to engage. Some are ethicists seeking to define the terms and rules of a new vocabulary. Some are trolls deliberately trying to stir up vitriol. Some are virtue posters eager to show off their ethics and boost their brand. Some are simply trying to tell their story. As you know, this conversation, if you can even call it that, plays out across multiple platforms in free-flowing, fast-paced, and sometimes quite cruel exchanges. The rough and tumble nature of hashtag debates provides grist for those who want to dismiss or ignore these conversations. Every time I reference one of these movements, people will point me to some egregious or unsettling post that comes branded with the hashtag. Look at this terrible thing. This is what this movement is all about? These are its values? The open source nature of online moral movements means that they can be difficult to define and easy to question. But this shouldn't scare the church away. A simple question can move us forward. Does the church need to accept everything that is said or done when accompanied by one of these hashtags? Of course not. In fact, understanding the dynamics of a hashtag movement can help Christian communities who seek to join these moral debates. At their best, a hashtag takes something that a person has experienced or witnessed and grafts it into a larger conversation, a shared pool of experience. These online conversations evolve and shift, almost like a school of fish flashing through the ocean. As they move, these flashing fish probe the boundaries of ethical conversations, the edges of a particular hashtag. Consider, as an example, this question. What counts as a Me Too experience? Gia Tolentino describes a post in which a woman speaks about an awkward first date, a dinner in which a guy speaks too much about himself, and concludes by typing #MeToo. The online response to this post was a fairly robust, you might even say brutal, discussion as to whether the post's author understands or appreciates the difference between feeling uncomfortable and the experience of sexual harassment or sexual assault. In a way, of course, this sort of hammer and tongs education is nothing new. Moral philosophers have explored the edges of ethical issues for millennia. Christian communities have done the same. Churches are forever debating and clarifying moral issues. This experience means we bring critical resources to the contemporary table. To quote Napoleon Dynamite, we've got skills. What does the church bring to the table? The brutal nature of contemporary online dialogue points to an area where I believe the church ought to play a critical role in the Great Awakening. Simply put, churches, seminaries, and denominations have a good deal of practice moderating conversations about controversial issues, often with an eye toward making space for diverse voices to be heard and in a manner that models respect, care, and love for those with whom we disagree. While most contemporary American churches have not participated in anything like the rigorous work done in South Africa by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, many have been informed by that work. And of course, many, many more Christians are shaped by the weekly liturgical practices of confession, pardon, and peace. The patterns of repentance, forgiveness, and regeneration are knit into the church's DNA. These ethical commitments can, should, and do change the tone of our dialogue. The core teachings of Christianity also encourage us to engage others, to expand the tent, to broaden the conversation. Every week, in facing our own brokenness and our complicity in the world's moral failings, the faithful lean into a paradigm modeled by Jesus and his disciples. It goes like this. Difficult ethical conversations are more than a zero-sum game, a tooth-and-nail battle fought by enemy tribes. Difficult ethical conversations are a vital crucible in which understandings can dawn, opinions can be changed, souls can be saved, reconciliation forged, and surprising relationships grow. One of the contemporary preachers who models this is Reverend William Barber II. Barber is appropriately identified as a critical voice in today's moral conversation, and as the modern preacher who has most clearly picked up the mantle of Martin Luther King Jr. Barber's preaching offers a no-holds-barred criticism of America's moral failures. It's racism, its tolerance of poverty, its inadequate public education system, its oppressive treatment of immigrants and migrants. And yet, when Barber preached at Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church to a diverse congregation of people from all over this city, he paired his criticism, as he always does, with a clear invitation for others to become part of the conversation, part of the Poor People's Campaign, part of a broad-based movement grounded in faith. In doing this, Barber refuses to hew to the fundamentalist strictures governing contemporary political speech on the left and on the right. He shies away from the sort of puritanical rigidity that Andrew Sullivan so frequently critiques. Rather than using ethical issues as a lever to pit race against race, and rather than speaking in broad terms about racial privilege, Barber stretches the boundaries of the conversation. He links the struggles of Black urban America to the poverty of white rural America. He notes that the disparities African Americans experience in receiving quality health care are real. And he notes that the death rate for young white men in this country, largely because of opioids and suicide, is rising faster than any other demographic. Rather than pit struggling people against each other, Barber bids them join together to embrace a larger vision. In a similar vein, the church has the potential to influence, and already is influencing in some quarters, contemporary moral conversations by providing an alternative to call out or cancel culture. Professor Loretta Ross teaches an incredibly popular class at Smith College that models a different approach to moral conversation. A veteran of decades of contentious ethical debates, Ross argues that we need to replace our current call-out culture with a call-in culture. She points out that while calling someone out may make you feel momentarily superior, it ultimately leads to anger and alienation. We're caught, says Ross, in almost unbreakable cycles of anger. We doom scroll, we read post after post that fans our rage, and then, out of fear, anxiety, and overflowing anger at those who do not get it, those we have determined are about to destroy all that we hold precious, we lash out. Ross argues that we sabotage our own happiness with unrestrained anger. She regularly asks her students, "Why are you making choices to make the world crueler than it needs to be, and calling that being woke?" The alternative to calling people out, Ross argues, is calling them into conversation and into relationship. This, Ross says, is a call made out of love. Here, the professor makes an appeal to the work of one of the most influential voices in the civil rights movement, Reverend C.T. Vivian. In the many marches and imprisonments and beatings that Vivian endured while working as Martin Luther King's field general, he lived and modeled Christ's seemingly impossible command: love your enemies. This, says Ross, is the sort of commitment today's moral conversations desperately need. They need radical love. 2,000 years and counting, and the thing that the world desperately needs from the church hasn't changed. Not really. What has changed And what continues to change, of course, is the place that the church occupies in society, the platform it has to talk about the love of God and love of neighbor. In the course of these lectures, we have considered the argument that America is now in a post-Protestant era. Others, like Stanley Hauerwas, would say post-Christendom or post-Christian period. And while we may disagree on the finer points of these arguments, I think most of us would agree that the church is no longer the primary initiator or adjudicator of ethical conversations in this country. We're not entirely out of the game, but we have most certainly been decentered. Now, some suggest that this is the church's natural posture, and this may be true. In any case, being decentered raises a strategic question for contemporary congregations and pastors. How should we engage in the moral conversations of the day? How should a decentered church approach the Great Awokening? I want to close today by examining two different cultural signposts that I think point the way for the contemporary church. One comes from the art world and one from literature. Before we go there, however, we need to take a brief excursion into philosophy and logic. Philosophers tend to divide human reasoning into three logical types: deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and abductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning makes a series of inferences based on and beginning with a widely accepted fact or truth. The Church of Christendom, relying on broad cultural agreement as to the truths of the faith, frequently made appeal to deductive reasoning. God is love. We all agree on that. This truth has implications for how you should live your life. 3 points and a poem, ta-da. Inductive reasoning reverses this logic. It moves from a series of observations about the world to draw a conclusion. Sherlock Holmes employed inductive reasoning to solve crimes. 50 years ago, homiletician Fred Craddock urged preachers to employ inductive reasoning in their sermons. Informed by the writings of Soren Kierkegaard, Craddock sensed atrophy and apathy among American Christians in the latter part of the 20th century. He urged preachers to equip their listeners with observations about text and life that would enable them to draw their own passionate conclusions about faith. If deductive reasoning works from a truth and inductive reasoning leads toward a truth, abductive reasoning imagines a framework that makes sense of, that explains what we're seeing. American philosopher Charles Peirce described abduction as a sort of educated guess. Others say that the best example of abductive reasoning is a medical diagnosis. To engage in abductive logic is to offer a theory, a story, a song, a creed that has explanatory power. Abductive logic is how humans make sense of what they're observing or encountering. I want to argue that abductive reasoning is what the decentered church and her clergy need to pursue in the midst of the Great Awokening. The angry, the truth-deprived, and the afraid are all eager for stories, songs, and creeds that can shine light on and bring understanding to this anxious and contentious moment. What does this abductive work look like? Fearless Girl and Charging Bull. Where can the church find examples of abductive reasoning that effectively, you might even say subversively, offer explanations for who we are and what we are called to be? I want to tell you a story from the world of art that offers a model for how the church can exert a sort of sacred, left-handed power at this moment in time. In December of 1989, under the cover of night, the Italian sculptor Arturo di Modica unloaded a 3.5-ton statue and installed it next to a Christmas tree in front of the New York Stock Exchange. According to di Modica, the statue, which he called Charging Bull, was intended as a gift to bolster the spirits of traders in the aftermath of the 1987 market crash. Now, at first, Wall Street wasn't sure it liked the bull. Workers removed it the next day. Then, a short time later, the bull reappeared and was temporarily installed on Bowling Green, a public city park in the area. It's remained in that spot to this day. Over the years, Charging Bull has become a popular and frequently photographed symbol in New York. It represents, says the artist, prosperity and strength. In March of 2017, another statue received a permit for Bowling Green and was temporarily installed facing Charging Bull. Standing with her hands on her hips in front of the snorting bovine is a much smaller but no less fierce figure, Fearless Girl. This new statue by the artist Kristen Visbal was commissioned by a Wall Street investment firm to call attention to the lack of women leaders in finance. It's also, some say, a sneaky bit of advertising for the sponsoring firm's index fund. The plaque below the statue states, "Know the power of women in leadership. She makes a difference," with SHE referring both to the statue and to the fund's NASDAQ ticker symbol. Shortly after Fearless Girl was installed, di Modica, the sculptor of Charging Bull, cried foul. In an emotional press conference, he accused Fearless Girl of attacking Charging Bull. He argued that Fearless Girl distorted Charging Bull by taking this proud creature and turning it into a villain. Di Modica threatened to sue to have the smaller statue removed. For her part, Visbal, the sculptor of Fearless Girl, stood firm. She calls the bull a stunning piece of art, but she also remarked, "The world changes." The controversy surrounding these temporary statues has been picked up and hashed over by countless blogs and journalists, and you can see why. It raises all sorts of fun cocktail party questions. How much control do artists have over the way their work is interpreted? What does power look like? A charging bull? A girl who will not back down? What's the difference between art and crafty marketing? We could spend all day debating these topics. The spoil sport that I am, though, I want to focus our attention on the aspect of this controversy that no one is disputing. It goes like this. Art, good art, interprets everything around it. French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas argued that if you were to take two books and print them side by side in two columns on the pages of a larger volume, the two texts would immediately start to interpret each other. You can also put two paintings next to each other on the wall from different artists in different centuries with different styles and subjects and contexts, and they will start to talk to each other as well. Art interprets art. Art also interprets the place where it's displayed, the street where it's installed, and the culture in which it is viewed. Art interprets the viewer too. Art, good art, goes after us. It questions us, wrestles with our beliefs, and inspires us to action. Art is abductive. It stands within the world, exuding a subtle, often decentered, interpretive power. And that's not a bad definition for the church. Churches are God's art. Now, many will say that a sunset is God's artwork, or a rose, or the last chortling call of a loon on a moonlit lake. And that's all true. The natural world displays God's general artistry. But God gets specific too. You know the story. Christ came and taught and healed. He suffered and died and rose. He called the disciples, gave them the gospel, and charged them to love each other and to go around preaching, casting out demons, and living the good news. Jesus challenged this motley crew to become the church, to be God's art. The church is the vision that God is painting for the world. And sometimes, of course, we mess up God's art in a major way. The church can obscure the good news through its foibles and failures, and yet God never gives up. God persists in asking groups of people to offer holy vision to the world. God does this because God loves the world, and God knows that without these visions, without a fearless girl, the charging bulls of the world would run rampant. Without the artistry of God, to use a phrase coined by Professor Cynthia Rigby, the world would be in trouble. What is the nature of this trouble? That question takes us to today's short story. All That by David Foster Wallace. The most provocative short story I've read in recent years comes from David Foster Wallace. It appeared in the New Yorker after his death, his suicide. The story is entitled All That. The narrator in this story is an adult man reflecting on his childhood. At the tender age of 5 years old, the man's parents gave him, for Christmas, a toy cement truck. It was made of solid wood, except for 2 steel rods that served as axles. The boy pulled the truck around on a string. The boy played with the cement mixer more than he played with any other toy. He did this because his parents led him to believe that it was an unusual cement mixer. It was, they told him, magic. According to his parents, the truck's magic worked like this. Whenever the boy pulled it, the drum on the back, the portion responsible for mixing the cement, would rotate. The enchantment was such that the drum rotated, though, only when the boy was not looking. On hearing this, the boy is thrilled. Immediately, he begins to devise all sorts of experiments to catch sight of the rotating drum. He tries whirling around really fast. He takes sidelong peeks in a mirror as he walks by. He asks his parents to pull the cement truck across the living room while he watches from outside the room through a keyhole. Nothing, of course, works. The boy's father's proud. His son's research has uncovered an important fact. There is no magic in the world. But that is not, ironically, what the boy has discovered. As an adult, the narrator observes, I came to realize the reason I spent so much time trying to catch the drum rotating is that I wanted to verify that I could not spot it. Curiously, the failure of the boy's experiments became a source of joy to him. Why? All the boy's experiments led him to conclude that there are some things in this world, in this life, that you simply cannot see. When the next Christmas rolled around, the boy was no longer playing with the truck. Although looking back on that experience, the narrator realizes that the magic cement mixer left a lasting impression on him. It opened inside of him a place, a space for reverence. This is how he describes it. The fact that the most powerful and significant connections in our lives are at times invisible to us seems to me a compelling argument for religious reverence. The most powerful and significant connections in our lives are invisible. That's quite a discovery. And later in the story, we learn that this discovery compels the narrator to enroll in seminary. In pursuit of mysterious, invisible, life-changing stuff. Ironically, the thing that is too often missing from Christian proclamation, including my own, is God. It's the audacious, daring suggestion that the mysterious, powerful, life-changing, loving, and love-inspiring God attested to in the life of Jesus Christ is still at work in our midst, seeking to redeem the world. Do you sense this? I wish we could sit this afternoon on a bench on the Austin Seminary campus today so that I could hear your take on this diagnosis. I really do. And I will imagine that happy possibility as I run back through the canaries in the coal mine to whom I've been listening and about whom we've been talking for the past 3 days. Andrew Sullivan laments arguments that have moral fervor but lack any sense of piety, religious practice, or the acknowledgement, to use Tillich's words, of the ground of all being. Ross Douthat claims that our cultural, moral conversations echo with theological language, but no longer connect with the metaphysics of faith. Gia Tolentino describes having ecstatic experiences in the flawed church of her childhood and having rejected organized religion, seeking to mimic these ecstatic experiences through drug use. David Foster Wallace writes about parents who use a prank to try and convince their son that there is no magic in the world. Each of these accounts is a lament. Each of these accounts laments the absence not of ethical conversation, because there's plenty of that, but the absence of the transcendent God and of those who are eager to point in that God's general direction. To talk of mystery and wonder, to testify to transcendent moments, it seems to me, is the calling that people desperately want the church to embrace in the midst of this great awakening. This is the missing foundation for all the ethical conversations our culture needs to have. I was so excited when I saw that the title of my friend Carlos Cardosa Orlandi's lectures referenced the world of enchantment. We have so much to learn from Pentecostal churches and other Southern Hemisphere Christians, and from mystics like Julian Norwich, who are willing to talk about their experiences of the divine. They help us to remember that before there were ethical codes carved into stone tablets, there was a burning bush. Before there was a Sermon on the Mount, there were 40 days in the wilderness, and before there was the tight-knit argumentation of the epistle to the Romans, there was Saul, knocked off his horse, sitting in the dust, listening to a voice calling to him from the darkness. All this takes me back to Karl Barth and the discussion we had about preaching and context in lecture number 1. Barth argued that proclamation requires that we hold the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. But his focus, we noted, was on the incarnational miracle that happens when these two live wires are brought together. God is present. On Sunday morning, when the bells ring to call the congregation and minister to church, Barth once wrote, there is in the air an expectancy that something great, crucial, and even momentous is about to happen. Worship services do this, Barth observes. In song and prayer and scripture, worship is constantly communicating that God is present here. So naturally, the people who come to these strange occasions, Pastor Barth calls worship services grotesque, bring with them a single burning question. Is it true? Is it true that this sense of a stationary pole amid changing appearances, of a righteousness not somewhere behind the stars, but within the events which are our present life? Is it true, this talk of a loving and good God who is more than one of the friendly idols, whose rise is so easy to account for and whose dominion is so brief? What the people want to find out and thoroughly understand is it true? Our willingness to answer this question will distinguish the church from all the other voices in the time of the Great Awakening. And it will pave the way for urgent moral conversations that can be conducted with surprising gentleness and even beauty. Is there anything more important for the church to do right now than to answer this question over and over and over again? Is it true? Thank you.